listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
All right, hope you're all well out there, and thanks for listening and the continued support of the Straight to Video podcast. So back in 2011, I got the chance to play bass alongside my friend Mickey Richards on drums as we did a super fun UK tour with the wonderful Johnny Monaco from Chicago. On the tour with us was our friends Magic 8 Ball, who managed to get us a slot on a festival called the International Pop Overthrow, which was being held at Liverpool's iconic Cavern Club. I hadn't heard of the festival before, but when we attended, I would never forget it. This was a multi-day event showcasing some of the finest power pop bands, not only from the UK, but all over the world. The festival was free, and each band that performed got to play at the Cavern Pub and later in the day at the Cavern Club itself, either in its amazing backroom venue or under the legendary arched brick wall made famous by the Beatles. The event ran like clockwork, and there was such a great vibe during the day we were there. After we performed, Johnny told me to check out the band playing in the other room as they were from Texas. I'm forever grateful he said that to me, because right then I fell in love with the band Ashbury Keys, and we all became great friends to this day and have met up on both sides of the Atlantic to hang out. So what am I getting to, and why is this relevant to this show? Well, on today's episode I speak to the organiser and founder of the IPO Festival, Mr. David Bash. David began the festival back in 1998 over in Los Angeles as a way to showcase some of his favourite power pop bands who were perhaps struggling to get gigs in the town, and he felt more people should know about them. Since then, the festival has become an annual event, growing from its hometown in LA to taking shows all over the USA, along with the annual Liverpool event and also Stockholm, Sweden. It really is something to behold. Now, David is a wonderful storyteller and a true lover of music, still avidly collecting records to this day and discovering new bands with the same excitement that we all had back in our teenage years, so it was great to connect with him and hear all about his journey. As always though, before we dive in, if you love some ass-kicking rock and roll coffee, then please visit our friends Dead Skull Coffee, who are offering listeners to this show 15% off their great ground or full bean coffee if you visit deadskullcoffee.co.uk and add the promo code STV on checkout. If you pick some up, maybe share a photo on social media and let everyone else know too. And continued love and good vibes to everyone who supports this show over on our Patreon page, which is at patreon.com/STVpod. If you too would like to get more involved in the show, our Patreon gives you early heads up on guests, a bonus podcast, and some exclusive merch too. We're building a fun little community over there and would love for you to join in as well. Alright, on with my chat with David Bash. David also has his own online show called Material Issues, which you can find on Facebook, and you can also learn more about the brilliant IPO, International Pop Overthrow Festival, by visiting internationalpopoverthrow.com. And I truly look forward to when the festival returns to the UK, hopefully next year, and perhaps get the chance to perform once again. But anyway, in the meantime, I hope you enjoy my chat with David Bash.
To west, trying to find myself.
So if it's all right, I just want to trace your journey a little bit as a music fan, and obviously getting into you being the founder of IPO. If I'm correct, you were born and raised in Poughkeepsie, New York. That's kind of upstate, right?
I lived in Poughkeepsie until I was 13. As you said, kind of upstate New York. It's about 70 miles north of New York City. I mean, when you're a kid, that's a lifetime away. Going to New York was a very big deal, when you're that age. My dad actually worked in Manhattan for a while, so he would drive down. He would make the 2-hour journey to New York every day.
There and back every day?
Almost every day for a while, yeah. It started to just take its toll on him. So when I was 13, our family moved down to a place called New City, which its claim to fame musically is that Blood, Sweat, and Tears recorded an album there and named it New City. So at that point, my dad's trip into the city wasn't that big a deal. And it helped me too, because I started cutting my teeth as a record collector by driving into New York and going to all the record shops. New City had, I don't know, 2 or 3 record shops, none of which sold any used records. And then you go into Manhattan and there's all these shops that are selling used records, things that had been out of print for years, I'd never seen, never heard of. Other shops that were selling promo copies of things that weren't out yet.
That's the gold.
This was like all a new world to me. At that point, I had a subscription to Billboard magazine. So I was reading a lot of music reviews. I was learning a lot. I was taking a lot of chances on records. If I saw an album that looked like it might be pop, looked like it might be melodic, you can tell. You look at the cover and the artists they just have that vibe about them. And then you look at the back and the song titles and the instrumental makeup and the whole thing. It's like, yeah, this looks like it has a shot.
Yeah. That's the thing with like musical genres though. Once I guess one band explodes, the industry around that kind of music, it follows that kind of format in a way, at least for a while. So you do familiarize yourself with where the artwork's going, where the style of the dress, everyone kind of copying similar things. So you do kind of get used to it after a while.
You do. And I was a voracious learner. I just wanted to know everything. I was listening to a lot of underground radio stations as well. So anybody who might play something that I wasn't familiar with, but that I could potentially love, was something I wanted to know about. Yes, so I really cut my teeth on top 40 radio. I don't know if in the UK they use the same term. I know you had charts just as we did with many different songs on them and some the same. But I was listening to a big radio station called WABC. That's when I was still in Poughkeepsie. And back then, we're talking about 1970, 71. Back then, you could hear Carpenters, followed by Led Zeppelin, followed by Johnny Cash, followed by the Jackson 5. And it would all just be music. It would all be good music. There were no labels. I mean, they would call the Jackson 5 soul. They would call Led Zeppelin rock. They would call the Carpenters pop. But it was all just good music, and it was all being played that way. So, I mean, I kind of fell in love with a lot of genres that way. But that eventually, listening to top 40 radio, once you got into high school, it was no longer cool. You had to listen to album rock.
You had to pick sides, I guess, at that point.
But I mean, I stuck with it for a while, but then I also gravitated to, as we said in the States, FM radio, starting to listen to albums. That's where I learned about, I don't remember what song, but the station WHLJ, maybe it was Baby Blue by Badfinger. It was a song by them that I knew. And the DJ said, and that's from the Straight Up LP. And I'm saying, what? What do you mean the Straight Up LP? Now we're talking 1975. I know I'm skipping around here.
That's all right.
I'm already in New City at this point, but I haven't bought many records yet. And I hear about Straight Up. So I start calling record stores and no, we don't have anything by Badfinger. It's all out of print. And it's like, oh my God, how am I ever going to find this? As it turned out, there was an import company called Gem Records that was in existence. I remember being in a record store, actually a department store with a record department. I'm looking through a section that says import LPs. And then suddenly I see Straight Up. Gem Imports had brought in a German pressing of Straight Up. I mean, my heart almost fell out of my head, fell out of my head. Yeah, I think it went into my head and then fell out of my mouth. I was so shocked.
What was the price tag on that? Can you remember?
$5.99.
Okay.
Which was a lot for a record at the time. I mean, normally they were going for $4.99 US pressings. And so an extra $1, I mean, that was something to think about. But I didn't think about that one at all. I immediately snapped that one up. I have another kind of weird memory like that, where it's like one of those heart attack moments where you find a record you just didn't think you would. When I first started college, one of my friends turned me on to Big Star. I'd never heard of them. I don't think anybody I knew had heard of them, but somehow he had. And he had, I don't know if he had number one record, but he certainly had Radio City. And we were playing that quite a bit. Of course, I called all kinds of record stores. No, we don't have that. Big Star? No, we know nothing about that. Okay, so our college bookstore announced a record sale where a whole bunch of records, they were bringing in a whole bunch of records, and they were going to be $1.99 each. I wasn't familiar with the term cutout yet, but it was clearly a bunch of cutouts that they brought in. I remember telling my friend Keith, because we were both going to go to this record sale, I remember telling him, Big Star is going to be in there. I don't know what possessed me to think that, but I said, there's going to be a copy of Radio City in there. So we went over and I'm looking through it, and there it is for $1.99. Again, another one of those oh my God moments where you just can't believe it. Even though I kind of had the sense that it would be there, when reality hit, it was like, oh, wow, this can't be happening.
You're expecting someone to come up behind you and snatch it away. You can't get two hands on it fast enough.
But I don't think anybody other than me and him knew about it. And I found it first, thankfully. Somehow, a few months later, I found number one record. That was kind of when I was starting to get into, I had heard about some Manhattan record stores. I must have bought it there. But yeah, there are moments like that. One other moment, when I came to the UK for the first time in 1979, there's an artist called Chris Rainbow. I don't know if you know him. Glasgow artist who recorded a few albums very much in that sort of Beach Boys meets Pilot vein. A friend of mine in the States had it, but it was only released on Polydor in the UK. I shouldn't say it. There were two albums at that point. I called record stores and I said, can you import these records? And they said, no, we can't. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to have to go to the UK to get this because you couldn't order things back then. I mean, of course, there was nothing online, but you couldn't even order things through ads in Goldmine magazine or record stores, nothing. If it wasn't a big name artist, they weren't going to bring it in. They weren't going to order one copy of anything for you. So I had to go to the UK. I went to London. And I didn't know anything about anything at that point. I just figure I'll walk around the city and record stores will show up. And that kind of happened. But I remember being on Oxford Street and walking into HMV. I think that was the first store I went to, November 1979. And I'm looking for a lot of things, but mainly Chris Rainbow. And so I figure, well, this guy's not known. I'll go to Rock R and look for him in there. So I look through the Rock R section, no Chris Rainbow. And I'm saying to myself, did I come all the way to the UK and I'm not going to find Chris Rainbow records? And then I thought, well, let me look right behind R. And he has his own section. And in there is Home of the Brave, which was his second album. Oh, no, Looking Over My Shoulder, which was his second album. And I'm just, another one of those moments. There it is. It's here. It's going to be in my hands.
How great is that, though? You don't get that with downloads. It makes me sound like a right old fart, but you don't get that connection with downloads.
No, I'm with you, Rob. Like I always tell people, I mean, if you have an album that's download only, I'm not going to even review it. It doesn't count. I mean, I'll listen to it, but I'm not going to write a review. I need physical product. CD, vinyl, even cassette. I don't care what it is. I have to be able to hold it in my hands. Yeah, you will not get that moment with a download. It's a visceral thing that just doesn't happen unless there's something visible in front of you and then tangibly a tactile experience of holding it in your hands. It's something that, as you said, young people don't really get. They don't care, which is fine. They don't have to care, but they're kind of missing out on that. Every generation misses out on whatever. And, our parents know about certain things that we never will and will never care about. And that's okay, too. I mean, that doesn't happen very much anymore because now it's like, if I find out about something that's rare, well, let's see if Discogs has it. They'll have it. Or let's see if Amazon has it. Or let's see if eBay has it. Invariably, they will. So it's very uncommon to have that experience now because now you know where to get things. But back then, it was just a crapshoot. Sometimes you got lucky that way.
Yeah, definitely. Over your years and stuff, you've definitely had a few touch points with the Beatles. Obviously, you have the IPO at Liverpool. You grew up in the 60s. Do you remember the Beatles on Ed Sullivan? I mean, you'd only be very, very young, like 5 or 6 years old. But do you remember it or anything, the buzz which surrounded it at that time?
I think I remember it. I think because, as you get older, you start conflating memories with things that you read about later. And suddenly it was something you actually experienced when, in fact, you didn't. I seem to recall, and this is where it all gets a little murky, but I seem to recall playing in our backyard and having my mom yell, "The Beatles are on." Seem to remember, again, I remember them doing Roll Over Beethoven. Did they even do that on Ed Sullivan? If they didn't, then I don't think I saw it. I probably saw them do that on television somewhere else, maybe a recording of something that had happened a few months earlier. So I probably didn't see it, but I was aware of it. I knew who Ed Sullivan was at that point. My parents were watching it. I probably wasn't even allowed to be awake that late, but I was aware of the Beatles. In fact, I do remember, and my parents would corroborate this at the time, being 5 years old and just running through our living room of our house singing Yeah, yeah, yeah. That was catchy as hell. Maybe I didn't sing She Loves You because I didn't like girls yet.
Yeah.
But I did sing Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the Beatles, they're part of the soundtrack of everybody's life who grew up back then. And even people who grew up later. It just seems like when you're indoctrinated into music, the Beatles are one of the first things that you hear. I don't know, that doesn't happen anymore, but it certainly did, even into the 90s, I'm sure, for a lot of people.
It was the same for me. I was like a big hard rock guy. Once I got into music at like 16, 17, the point where I was like really consuming it, picking as much hard rock stuff as I can. But even then, I just wanted more music. So I was like, okay, it's almost my duty to go and listen to some Beatles, to go and listen to some David Bowie. Just soak it in, at least taste it and see what all the fuss is about.
Of course. 100 years from now, and God knows what life will be like in 100 years. 100 years ago, no one could have even imagined what's happening now. But 100 years from now, no matter what happens, just about, save a nuclear holocaust, and even then, maybe, if any sort of history is preserved, the Beatles will still be known about. If no one else is from this period, they will be.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I think is really cool, and I found out about you, you mentioned you got into top 40 radio, but other than the music, you also really liked the statistics side of it. Our songs went up and down, you connected it with math and all that kind of thing, and you liked the way all that worked. That was an attraction.
Very much so. Almost anything in life that had numbers attached to it was attractive. I just took to math very quickly when I was a child. And yeah, one of the things that was cool about listening to top 40 radio, let's say WABC, they would have their weekly survey, which was their chart, essentially. And yeah, you would hear about songs rising and falling on the charts, and that was great. And then, of course, at the end of each year, they would have their top 100, the list of their top 100 songs of the year based upon, how well they did on their own chart. I remember in 1970, they had their heavy 100 of 1970, because heavy was part of the vernacular then. Heavy, of course, meaning something important. I had my notebook. I wrote down the numbers 1 to 100. And the cool thing was they didn't count them down in order. They did it random. They did it starting Christmas morning and going to January 1st. And they would just play these songs. I mean, they would play the ones that finished in the top 10 more often than the ones that finished in the bottom reaches. But you had to, in order to find out what they were, you had to write them down. And there would be a few you had to wait, It wasn't like I was listening 24/7, but there were a few that you just had to wait for. And I did that for the next several years, just being really excited about, what, and I would make predictions, like what would be in the top 10, what number would they be? I never got number one right. I did it from 70 through 74 on WABC, and I never got number one right. I mean, the one I predicted to be number one always did well, but it was never the number one. And then in November of 1972, I was just tuning in to the radio. I was listening to FM at this point a little bit. And suddenly I hear a song. I don't remember exactly which song it was. I hear the tail end of it. It's something I like, so I stay with the station. And then I hear a voice saying, and that was number 37 on this week's survey. This is Casey Kasem, and you're listening to American Top 40. And it's like, what? And then the next song turned out to be All the Young Dudes by Mott the Hoople. It had just entered our charts at that point, and it was number 36, I believe. And I was hooked. I almost never missed an American Top 40 from then on for like 8 years. And in fact, that's what got me to get my subscription to Billboard, because I knew that they had they listed, the top 40, actually the whole 100 charts of each week. And I could actually see them before the show was even aired. So I thought myself, I'm really cool. My friends they're going to be listening to the show, and I could say, well, I already know it's going to be number one or whatever. But yeah, that prompted me to get the subscription to Billboard, just being able to see that chart. So yeah, statistics, numbers, rising and falling of records. It was, almost as big as the music itself.
So you say that was 1972. Now, if I've got my timeline right, it was a couple of years after that your mom took you to buy your first album when you was 15. Is that right?
I can't believe this is David Bash. This is your life.
But no, what I'm wondering, was you just consuming music as a listener up to that point?
Yeah, and I had a cassette recorder, so I would record things from the radio. Eventually, I had a built-in recorder to a stereo where I would do the same thing. But no, I hadn't I didn't have a turntable. I don't even think my parents had a turntable yet. I think they just had a cassette and maybe an 8-track in our car. So I didn't have a turntable yet. And my mom actually didn't take me to buy records. She just took me shopping with her and we went to a mall. And I think I had like $28 or something. And I could buy either one of two things with it that I wanted: a stopwatch, which I was very much into stopwatches then, and watches in general, which I still am. It was either that or I went into a record store. I noticed that they had the Beatles' Red and Blue albums. I looked at it and there were songs I knew and there were songs I didn't know, and they were on cassette. And I remember asking my mom, which one should I get? And she said, the Beatles will always be timeless. And she was not a music fan. Well, she was, as far as like she liked movie soundtracks and more adult acts like Andy Williams and Perry Como and people like that. She wasn't into rock and roll at all, but she knew about who the Beatles were, of course, and she knew that they were timeless. So it was probably at her advice that I went and bought those cassettes. And I didn't buy much after that for a while. This became almost like the story of the Beach Boys when they started playing music. The parents went on vacation. They left them money for food, and they ended up renting instruments and recording. When they came home, Murray, their dad was furious at them for using the money for that. But Brian then said, "Come hear what we recorded." And he played it and Murray just cried like a baby and said, "Yeah, this is what you guys should start doing." It was kind of like that with me, too. My parents went away and left us some money for food, and I used some of it to go to a local record store, and I picked up some cassettes: Neil Diamond's Greatest Hits, Elton John's. Back then, it was just Greatest Hits albums. Elton John's Greatest Hits, the Guess Who's Greatest Hits. And this was 1975 already, so it's like several months after I bought the Beatles cassettes. And then finally, I convinced my dad to get me a stereo, which included a turntable. And I remember my mom saying, "Why do you want to buy a turntable? Are you going to buy that many records?" I said, "Yeah, I will. Don't worry about it.
Just watch me."
Yeah, within about a year and a half, I had over 1,000 LPs.
You just dived in, like it just became all consuming.
Whatever money I had went to records for years after that. Pretty much everything I had, whatever I earned, whatever was given to me, all of it went to records.
Wow. Did you enjoy music? I don't know if this sounds strange. Did you enjoy music with friends, or did the music and the band you listened to almost become your friends, if that makes sense?
Mostly that. I mean, there were some friends I had with whom I would listen to music, but it was mostly, I was very much an introvert. I was a pretty weird kid. I didn't have a lot of friends. That was a bit disappointing, but on the other hand, I did enjoy alone time quite a bit. So no, music had long been my friend. I had when I started listening to Top 40 radio, it was a really rough time in school. I was in grade 6 and was not getting along with people. Yeah, really tough time. And I would go home and turn the radio on, and those songs became my friends. I took that into buying records, mostly listening by myself in my room, my bedroom. And yeah, it was that way for quite a while, actually, until I became an adult and started finding other people who liked the music I did and going record shopping with them or whatever. But yeah, for several years, it was mostly just me. When I was in college, back then, you were kind of forced into becoming a little bit more social. So at that point, I found friends who had, like I said, I had the one friend who turned me on to Big Star. So I had friends that liked a lot of the same music. We would turn each other on to different things. But yeah, it was very much part of the world that I had created for myself, by myself, more than anything else.
Did you have a particularly favorite band around that time, or was you just grabbing anything? You just wanted to consume all different kind of music? If you could say which was the band which you loved the most as a kid, or around that time when you were diving in, was there anybody in particular?
When I was diving in, I mean, the Beatles first, but then I started getting into the Beach Boys. First, I got Endless Summer album on cassette, so that was a greatest hits, essentially. Then I started getting into the later stuff, another greatest hits compilation, but the stuff that was on Brother Records. Then I started buying their proper albums, and yeah, it was a love affair, and still is. The Beach Boys are still my number one group. The Beatles are a close second. I know that's blasphemy to a lot of people, but they are a close second. It's not like they're number 73.
That's the good thing about music. You can consume it all. I'll listen to this today. I'll listen to the other one tomorrow.
Right. But the Beach Boys became my favorite band probably sometime in late 1976. And they stayed that way and probably always will be.
Were live shows a big thing for you, or was it all about just buying records and listening to music? You was kind of near New York for a while.
Yeah, I know. Ironically, given what I'm doing now with IPO, Back then, live shows meant very little. I could count on two hands how many shows I'd seen in the late 70s, even though I had CBGB's, The Bottom Line, the Palladium, all these amazing clubs in Manhattan. At that point, I was going to New York University. So this stuff was in my backyard. But, I had a limited amount of money, as somebody that age does. And it came down to a choice. Do I want to spend $10 to see a show, or do I want to spend that $10 on 3 or 4 records? And the choice was pretty easy for me. I mostly bought records. I like I said, all these bands coming out of the punk scene and the new wave scene and everything in New York was all at my fingertips. And I've never, in my whole life, I've never even set foot in CBGBs. I regret that so much to this day. Even when I went to Manhattan and I started IPO, the club was still around. I never went there. And then they closed. I'll never have a chance. But it was right there. I mean, I can't tell you how many amazing bands I had the chance to see in their formative years, and I just never went. And plus, also, going to shows was more of a social event. And, as I said, I wasn't the most social guy at that point. I didn't always have people to go with. I think if I was more of an extrovert and I had friends, I probably would have spent more money on going to shows. But I didn't want to go alone. It wasn't like, well, I'll meet somebody cool there. It was like, I don't want to be around a bunch of strangers.
It's tough.
Yeah, it was. So it was a very easy choice for me. I spent, like I said, almost every dollar I had went to records.
Well, you've certainly made up for it in later years, seeing bands.
I do remember one time telling my dad, one day I'm going to do something that makes an impact in music. I don't know what it is. IPO wouldn't have been anything I could have conceived of at that time. And at that point, I only knew major labels anyway. So my vision at that point was probably something like, I'll own a record company, something like that. But I knew that on some level, I was going to do something in this industry that made an impact on people's lives.
How old was you when you said that to your dad?
Oh, gosh, maybe 19 or 20. I mean, that was when I was first really starting to get into records, and it became so all-consuming. I mean, I was in college. I didn't study that hard. I got by. But I kind of knew that business, as it were, wasn't really going to be for me. I just had this inkling that it was going to be something that was less business oriented and more of a passion, whatever it was going to be. And music was my passion. So there you go.
You mentioned you went to university in New York. You studied journalism.
Yes. At that point, I did.
Do you have any particular goal where you wanted to take that? Was it to go into music journalism, kind of like a Lester Bangs kind of thing? Or was it just something that sounded interesting as something to study?
It sounded interesting. Plus, when I had been in high school, like I said, math I always really took to well. Things that were more verbal, English. We had classes called English, which I'm sure sounds really weird to people from the UK. But that's when we learned things like grammar and about different writers. So we'd read different books and things like that. But I didn't take that well to that, and I wasn't all that good at it. So I started college studying business administration because my dad was in business, and I figured, well, that's what I'm going to do. And I quickly felt disenchanted with that. And I thought, I've got to do something else. So journalism appealed to me at that time, mainly because I wanted to bridge the gap between my knowledge of math and my knowledge of more verbal entities. So I did that by studying journalism. And then I got to really like it. My specialty then was writing captions for ads. I was really, really good at that. So I thought I was going to become like the new Darren Stevens from Bewitched, if you're familiar with that show. It was a big show in the States, and Darren Stevens, he was married to a witch. And so it was all about that. It was a comedy, of course, but he was an advertising executive, and he used to write captions for ads. And I thought, oh, I'll become another Darren Stevens. But that ended up not happening. But I grew to love it. I really did. But even then, I don't know if I had an ambition to become a music writer. I still didn't really know what I wanted to do at that point. I knew I loved music, but I didn't know what path I was going to take.
Was it your whole family who relocated to California when you were in your early 20s?
Yeah.
How was that for you, moving to the West Coast in your early 20s? Was that pretty cool?
At first, no, I resisted it. I mean, if you're from New York, a lot of New Yorkers viewed Californians as being just sort of frivolous, laid back, being into things that weren't of any substance, being superficially friendly, but internally not having much going for them. So there were the stereotypes. So when I came out here, I kind of fought against the culture. I tried to imbue some New York into it, and they weren't having it. But after about 6 months, I started to really like it. I adapted. One thing about New York, people were very, very aggressive. I was in Manhattan where people would look at you, they'd size you up immediately and decided if they liked you or they didn't. So they didn't really give you a chance. You just sort of were or you weren't. And in my case, a lot of times, I wasn't. So people would be, people could be in New York, could be very verbally cruel to other people. And the one thing I learned in California was that's just not how people were as much. People gave you a shot. They figured if you were friendly, they would be friendly. Maybe it was all on the surface. I don't know. But I started to gravitate towards that.
Did that help you with your communication skills?
Absolutely, it did. I went back to college. I was fairly aimless at that time. I had a journalism degree, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with it. So my mom said, you've always had an affinity for psychology. Why don't you go back to school and study that? So I did. And that's where I really started to make friends with a lot of other students, because in California, it was just easier to do that for somebody like me, for somebody who wasn't that social, but who was a generally easygoing, friendly kind of guy. People took to that. I stayed in school. I went to graduate school, started studying cognitive psychology. So I was doing studies about the brain and all kinds of stuff. And it was very heady. I enjoyed it to some degree, but then I started to become a bit out of my depth. We're talking about mathematics that were 100 times more than anything I ever experienced. I couldn't handle it. But, I always kept my love for records going. I was buying records. Now that I was actually working as a teacher's aide and being paid by the university. So I had more money to spend on records at that point.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. And at that point, I had made friends with whom I went record shopping. I remember one time going to a record shop down in Encinitas, California, which was about a couple of hours south of where I was living. I walk in and I'm here, I don't know, it may have been the mod band, the Direct Hits, who were from the UK. And I'd never heard of them. And this clerk, he turned out to be the manager of the store. He was playing it. And I ran up and said, who are they? And he told me the Direct Hits. And I said, I love this. I want to buy it. He said, well, if you love that, let me play you this. Eventually, he and I, his name's Phil Galloway, we became really good friends. Every time I'd come in there, he'd say, I've got some Bash stuff for you.
Bash stuff, brilliant.
Yeah, and he would start playing me other things, and he turned me on to all kinds of... He was very much in tune with what we called back in the 80s, the college radio scene. And that's when the word alternative really started to become in vogue. It didn't become part of the mainstream until later, but back then it was used to describe what college radio stations were playing. So he turned me on to a lot of bands from the US, the UK, from Australia. He turned me on to the band, the Zimmermen, who were from Melbourne, I think, or maybe Sydney, I don't remember. All kinds of stuff. Yeah, and I was learning a lot on my own also, going to record shops, taking chances on things. Lots and lots of used record shops in Los Angeles. So I was finding out about everything. Yeah, it was like New York to the third power. It was really something.
Excellent. We've come forward quite a few years. So I guess around in the 1990s, you begin to write for fanzines. Did that open up a new world to you to lesser known bands, or was that your way to expose those bands to more people? Was you in on those bands already and you wanted to tell everybody about them?
Both, actually. At that shop that I described to you earlier called Off the Record, where Phil was turning me on to things, I found a magazine called Yellow Pills. And obviously, I knew the 2020 power pop classic, Yellow Pills. So I thought, this looks interesting. And I just read reviews of all these pop bands. You could tell by the descriptions that this was music I was really going to like. So I started contacting all these bands who were in there. Can I buy your record? Whatever it was, CD, cassette, vinyl, mostly 7-inch vinyl at that point, not LPs. So I learned a lot about, underground music, the power pop scene, as it were, through Yellow Pills. Jordan Oakes, who ran that fanzine, I called him on the phone. We'd have conversations. So that's what really got me into learning about these albums. And then a few other fanzines started springing up, like Oddities, Amplifier. And that's when I decided I wanted to start writing and expose fans of that genre to that kind of music. Plus, I knew they would send me some free music.
Bonus.
I wasn't very rich at that time, so it was like, yeah, bring it on. It was a win-win situation. I was getting free stuff. I was learning about more stuff. I was telling the world about more stuff. So it was through the writing and the reading that I learned about enough of these bands to where a few years later, when I had this germ of the idea to start IPO, the reason I knew I could do it was because I knew about enough bands. Plus, in LA, there was a really burgeoning pop scene at that point. We're talking about the mid 90s now. You know, the grunge thing had just happened, and bands were being signed to labels left and right. After Nirvana, especially, after they hit it big, everybody else wanted to find the next grunge thing. And so you'd read about all these grunge bands being signed and selling records and the whole bit. So we thought in LA that the pop scene was going to start to happen. Plus, there was also an indie rock scene happening in the area known as Silver Lake. You had the Dust Brothers producing, you know, all these bands. Beck was coming out of there. And we thought, well, LA is going to be the next Seattle. And so there were a lot of bands happening, and they were all very supportive of each other because they all wanted to be signed. They wanted their friends to be signed. It was going to be a whole huge thing. So there was a huge scene happening. This gentleman, Tony Perkins, he had been putting on bi-weekly pop shows called Bubblegum Crisis. And it was through that and other people that I knew that I really got immersed into that local scene. So before you know it, I knew hundreds of bands that were doing melodic music. It was through that, plus the writing of the reviews, that I just developed this base of these underground bands that were playing music that I loved.
Just to go on a slight tangent with you saying some great pop bands in the mid-90s, do you remember a band called Ginger Soul?
Not only do I remember Ginger Soul, they played IPO on the night that I really got to know Rena. It was August 4th, 2001 at IPO. At that club Spaceland that was in Silver Lake that I had mentioned. We were doing an IPO show, and Nelson Bragg, people now know as being a member of Brian Wilson's backing band for many years. He had gone to college with Rena in New York State. And when she moved out here, he knew about it. And he said, I'm playing this music festival, playing in this band, come out and see us. And she did. And that was at an earlier IPO show the week before. And at that point, he had just said, David, this is Rena. And I was really busy that night, so I only had time to say hello. Then fast forward a little over a week, Nelson contacts Rena and said, I'm playing in another band at IPO. It's at this club Spaceland. So she shows up. I'm standing outside working off nervous energy because that's what I do before every IPO show. I see her coming up the street and I recognize her from having met her a week before. And she asked, when is the show starting? And I said, in about 15 minutes. And we started talking, and immediately I liked her and I knew I wanted to get to know her better. So, you know, we go in, the show starts, and after every band, I go up and introduce a band and I run right up to her and we start talking more. Later in the night, Ginger Soul gets on, and I introduce them. And on my way off the stage, I trip over a guitar chord, and I almost fell flat on my face.
I wasn't expecting this to go that way. I just wondered if you remember the band. That's crazy.
Oh yeah, no, if you mention a band this is the one thing about IPO. If you mention a band that I've heard of, there's a decent chance I'll have a story connected. I mean, it may be something that's completely superfluous, but it also may have some relevance to something else. But yeah, no, I'm sorry if I pulled this way out of
I love that.
But yeah, so I'll never forget Ginger Soul for that reason. Well, I mean, I really liked the band also. They were just a really cool kind of alternative rock band that I thought were great.
Their 1995 EP is one of my all-time favorite releases of all time. I'm still in touch with Steve on Facebook.
Oh, are you really? Yeah, no, we're friends, but I haven't spoken with him for a while.
Yeah, I tried to get him on the show, but we've not been able to hook it up because that guy's like relentless on releasing stuff. He's constantly releasing albums, like acoustic stuff all the time.
Yeah, well, if you're relentless with him, I'm sure ultimately you'll have him on the show.
So writing for fanzines, would you say this was kind of the seed of what brought IPO to life? You had bands showing an interest to play in Los Angeles, so you thought you might be able to put something like that together for them.
That guy, Tony Perkins, who I mentioned, put together a festival called Poptopia. It was mostly LA bands, doing punk, pop, power pop, all kinds of different melodic stuff. I thought it was great. I knew a lot of the bands who were playing, so it was great to be able to see them all on this one. I don't remember how many days it was, maybe 5 or 6, in all these different venues around Los Angeles. And then he would have some bands from out of town come in, including ones I really liked, like the Rubinoos and the Beatifics, a whole bunch of other ones. I thought this was great. word got around about Poptopia all over the worldwide pop scene. And because I was writing reviews and I got to know a lot of bands, I would hear from bands saying, how do I get into this Poptopia thing? We want to come to Los Angeles. We want to play. And I said, well, I know the guy who runs it. Let me see what I can do. So I asked him before the second Poptopia was going to happen. I said, Tony, can I help bring some bands to your attention? I've been getting to know a lot of bands from all over the world who I think are worthy of playing Poptopia. And he said, yeah, please go ahead. So I did that. I would tell bands about Poptopia and I gave them Tony's email address. And invariably, he didn't have enough room for too many of those bands. He really kind of wanted it to be more of a local flavor. So we had to turn a lot of them down, not because they weren't good enough, just because there wasn't enough room. You know, they would commiserate with me. They'd say, man, you know, we really wanted to play. He told us there wasn't enough room. You know, we're really bummed. And that's what got me to think this is really sad. You know, there should be a way for these bands to come to Los Angeles and play. And it was December of 1997. I was sitting in a fast food restaurant called Carl's Jr. with a friend of mine, a music attorney named Ben McLean. And he was familiar with Poptopia also. So we're just talking. And I said, you know what? I've seen what Tony does. I think I can do it too. And I would like to do it, but with less of a purely LA kind of feel and more of a worldwide feel. And he said, you should. And that's really all it took. So I remember a few weeks later, there was a local show at a dear departed club called Jack Sugar Shack at that fabled corner of Hollywood Boulevard and Vine Street, where all the actors were discovered in the early 50s. It was a great room. We loved it. And I thought, everyone I know is going to be there. This is the time to announce the festival. But I also knew Tony was going to be there. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know, how's he going to take it? You know, I'm telling him I'm going to be running a rival festival. Oh my God. So I told a bunch of the bands and they were all really excited. And of course, I'll be inviting you to play. So I was like, oh, wow, great. And then I remember seeing Tony sitting outside the venue by himself. And I said, Tony, I have some news. I'm going to be doing my own music festival. And, you know, he just said, oh, wow, when is it? And I said, look, please know, I'm not trying to be your rival. I think we can coexist. I'm going to do the festival 6 months after Poptopia. I want to make sure that there's room for both festivals during the year. There won't be overlap. There won't be any fatigue factor. I mean, you see these bands in February and you see them again in August, you know, no problem. Plus, I'm going to have a whole bunch of bands that you're not going to have anyway. So I set about to invite bands from all the ones who wanted to play Poptopia that couldn't. I said, well, I'm doing my own thing and you're invited. And I mean, it was bands from all over the country, all over the world. And I was shocked at how many said, okay, you know, I knew some would. It's like back then, flights weren't that expensive. You could actually fly to Los Angeles and play. But I got a lot of discouragement from local people who said, people aren't going to come to see bands from out of town and out of the country. They've never heard of them. How are you going to bring people in? I'm worried about you, David. I don't think this is going to work. So that did kind of put a little bit of a scare into me, but I was undaunted. I'd already said I was doing this. I wasn't going to back out. So I just went ahead. Tony had given me contacts to a lot of the venues that he was using. So I contacted them and I said, you know, I'm going to be doing something that's similar to Poptopia. Are you interested? And most of them were. So IPO happened in August, the first one, August of 1998. And I had 110 bands that year. It was over 7 days. And many of them were from outside of LA. It may have been 50-50, actually. We had enough local bands that I thought, well, we'll have a nice crowd for the bands who came from all over the world to play. What I was pleasantly surprised about were people came to this thing from all over the world and local people. They thought it was exotic. They wanted to see these bands. It's like, wow, you've got bands from Australia, you've got them from the UK, you've got them from Spain, from Italy, from it's like, yeah, we want to see this. It was a huge, huge success. I was so relieved. I had so much fun. And I mean, I didn't know half of what I was doing back then. You know, we ran into some difficulties. Sometimes when gear stopped working, oh my God, I got to get another amp. Where am I going to get it? I only have a few hours. Somehow it all worked out.
That's the cool thing though. Like you say, you're not necessarily having name bands. You're not having to commit to that. People are buying into the brand. I want to come to this because it's IPO, not because such and such is playing. I want to come for the event and discover new bands. That's the cool thing about it.
That was always my thing. I was always into the underdog. I didn't care about big names. I mean, if I happened to like a band who was a big name, then great, come play. but it was always about which bands did I think were talented, which ones did I like, which ones did I think other people would like. And I wanted to give them a platform. That's what IPO was always about. One of the reasons I named the festival International Pop Overthrow was because I wanted to create an international pop scene that would overthrow mainstream radio. Because back then, what were they playing? Korn and Limp Bizkit and Britney Spears, and it was just it wasn't what we wanted to hear. So I want to bring melodic music back. And at that time, it was reasonable to believe that this could happen because there were still major labels out there. They were still recruiting bands. Geffen had their subsidiary DreamWorks. They were signing some cool melodic bands. So I thought maybe this could happen. Maybe we could overthrow the mainstream with an international pop scene. And it was all about the bands I thought were good. If a band happened to be popular, that was just icing on the cake. But it was all about bringing bands who were good to the attention of people who could dig what they did. And it worked the first year. Yeah, it was really, really successful.
You mentioned the name. It's also, you took the name from an album by the band Material Issue, which I feel is a band I should pay more attention to because so many times it's been brought up by musicians I admire. And you even have your own online show called Material Issues as well. So yeah, I definitely need to dive into some of their stuff.
You really should, Rob. Yeah, that was the other reason. I was speaking with my friend Brian Casson. He was a local musician, had a great band called Chewy Marble at the time, just a really good power pop band. And I didn't know what to name the festival at that time. So I'm kind of talking to him about it. And I said, I want something to evoke an international pop scene. So he said, international pop. And right then I thought, oh my God, International Pop Overthrow. And it's got two really important meanings. The one that I had mentioned, and also I wanted to pay tribute to Material Issue. Their lead singer-songwriter, Jim Ellison, had tragically taken his own life about a year earlier. You know, we were all still very devastated about that. And they were a quintessential power pop band. They started in the late 80s. They got signed to Mercury Records, put out their International Pop Overthrow album in 1991. I said, I want to pay tribute to them. Let's name the festival after their debut album. So yeah, it meant a lot to be able to do that. And yeah, I mean, I think any fan of power pop, if they don't know about Material Issue, they really should. I mean, as I said, quintessential, the power and the pop. A lot of power pop bands are a little bit more on the power side, less on the pop side. A lot more power pop bands are a little more on the pop side, less on the power side. Material Issue had both. And Jim Ellison had an amazing stage presence. And they were only a three-piece, so somebody had to really kind of draw attention to the band, and he did. I got to see them in early 1991. I hadn't heard of them at the time. I remember thinking that lead singer has some attitude. And then they went on to release 4 albums. You know, unfortunately, then Jim died, and that was that. But yeah, I mean, it's always been an honor to have been able to pay tribute to them. And, you know, as it turned out, throughout the years of IPO, the karma came back to reward me, I guess. When we brought the festival to Chicago, the 2 remaining members of Material Issue, who had their own bands at that time, they were honored that we named the festival after their band, and they had their bands play the festival. And then the culmination of that was in 2011, Universal Records, who now own Mercury, decided to do a 20th anniversary edition of the International Pop Overthrow album. And they stuck like 12 bonus tracks on there. So it was an amazing reissue. So the 2 remaining members said, you know, we should put something together and go out and tour this reissue. But of course, Jim wasn't around. So it's like, who are we going to get to sing lead and play guitar? And there was a local musician named Phil Angotti, you know, had played IPO many times. I knew his stuff. I really liked him. They got him. He had been very good friends with Jim. He knew the songs up and down. He could even sing them and play them like Jim. So they got him. And when I found out about this, I said, my God, they have to play IPO Chicago. I mean, how can they not? So I contacted them and they agreed to play. And it was at this venue called the Abbey, which held about 600 people, and we sold it out. It was great. All these Material Issue fans came out to see it, and I was so honored. I think of all the introductions I've ever done for a band, that one was the one for which I was A, most honored, and B, most nervous. I didn't want to blow that one in front of all these Material Issue fans. Thank God I said the right words, and they did an amazing show. It's like Jim's spirit was imbued in Phil Angotti. I had never seen anything like it. He played played the songs and sang them just as Jim would. The band was tight. Two other guys still, they had the chops. It's always going to be the biggest thrill I'll ever have. It all came full circle at that moment.
Oh, for sure. And the festival obviously grown and grown. You mentioned some other places it's played, Chicago. You regularly come to Liverpool at the Cavern Club and the Cavern Pub. And I want to thank you because I made some really great friends at the first IPO in Liverpool, the Ashbury Keys from Texas.
Oh, yeah.
We've all become great friends and met up on both in the UK and in America since. I mean, that really is the magic of this stuff and live music in particular. Because, like you say, you even met your wife at IPO as well. It's nuts.
There have been a few relationships that were forged at IPO, several of which led to marriages, not just mine, but other people that I know. Cliff Hillis, for example. I don't know if you know him, but he's pretty well known in the underground pop scene in this country. He met his wife, Beth Lennon, at IPO. And so they got married and are still together. There have been a few. Music does bring people together, certainly. And, if you have a man and a woman who have similar musical tastes, that's a great foundation from which to build. Often it works. And that's a very big thing. I mean, the one thing that male record collectors or male music fans are concerned about is what's going to happen if I meet a woman and I really like her, but she's not into my collecting. What's it going to be? Is it going to be like, well, if we live together, if we get married, of course you're going to get rid of your records, aren't you? No. And it's like, well, no, I'm not. No way. So, you worry about that. And when I was collecting and I was in relationships, my biggest concern was, well, I hope at least she tolerates it because I have no intention of getting rid of my records. I mean, I lived with my girlfriend prior to Rena, and she was a big music fan too. So that worked out well, thankfully. But she didn't want me spending as much money on records as I was because IPO wasn't making me a whole lot of money. She was worried about practical things like paying the rent and food. I knew we would handle it. So although she certainly fostered my love of music and she got very involved in IPO, she didn't want me spending as much. When Rena and I got together, and Rena was, at that point, she really only knew some classic rock. I mean, she loved what she knew, but she didn't know that much. She just went full bore into IPO and she encouraged my spending on records. So I got so fortunate in that way. Well, in so many ways with her, but that was one of them. Again, I don't know if you ever, are you married? Was that ever a concern for you?
I'm married 11 years. We've been together for like 27 years this year.
Wow.
But yeah, she's a big music fan, but she hates all my kind of music. So,
at least she tolerates you doing it. She doesn't tell you like you got to sell.
We meet in the middle sometimes.
Well, yeah, there's always some place where you can meet in the middle at least. But there was never any question. I mean, she never said like, well, we need the money. You've got to start selling it was never like that. I mean, it's happened. I've known relationships to break up over that. And in fact, there's that meme. I've posted this on Facebook a few times where it's a meme of a couple and the woman is saying, it's either me or the records. The guy had such insult to injury. He said, let me wait till this song's over and I'll help you pack. And that's like my favorite meme of all time. Because not only is he saying, you're free to leave, but I'm not even going to help you until this song is over. That's how important music is to me. Thankfully, that never happened.
You mentioned about Material Issue getting together, but I think you said one of your goals would be to reunite Jellyfish at IPO. What are the chances of getting the new band, the Licorice Quartet, to play at a future event, do you think?
I would say that chances of Licorice Quartet playing are probably reasonable. Again, COVID has changed the landscape. When things are back to normal, if Licorice Quartet does go out and play shows, I'd say there's a pretty decent chance of it happening at IPO. I mean, Roger Manning has played IPO many times. Eric Dover, his band Sextus played IPO.
He's phenomenal, man. He's phenomenal.
Yeah, he is. He's a really nice man. So yeah, I would say that there's a pretty decent shot of it happening. As far as Jellyfish goes, it's interesting you bring them up now because a few days ago on the Material Issues podcast, we had Jason Faulkner. And I asked Jason, because Jason had a very trying time in Jellyfish. Even though he enjoyed it, playing the music, he wanted to have his songs in there. Andy and Roger didn't. So they were at loggerheads for a while. And, for a while, he wouldn't even play any Jellyfish songs live. And then suddenly he started to play a couple of them and he would joke, this is my therapy. And then he'd play The Man I Used to Be or something. But time has passed. And obviously he and Roger they reunited and they did the TV Eyes thing. So they were friends. So I asked Jason on the podcast, would you consider doing a Jellyfish reunion? He said, yes, I would. But he said, I don't think Andy's would ever consider it. He's made it very clear that he has no interest. They were invited to play Coachella one year and apparently were offered quite a handsome sum to do it, and Andy turned them down. He has no interest, but my belief is never say never. And I always put it to people like this. If in 1995 you went up to people and said, within 10 years, Brian Wilson is not only going to finish Smile, he's going to go out on tour. I'll bet you $1,000 that's going to happen. You'd be a billionaire by now because everyone would have taken that bet. There's no way in hell. And if you had asked Brian in 95, he would have said...
He'd have took that bet as well.
It was a Smile. What Smile? I have never heard of that. I mean, that's kind of how he would have responded back then. So you would have thought, no chance. No chance in a million years. And then it happened. So do I think a Jellyfish reunion will happen? Probably not. But do I think there's a possibility? Yes, of course. As long as somebody's alive and healthy enough to play, there's a possibility of anything. I've told Roger, look, if it's going to happen, it has to happen at IPO. So never say never. It would be beyond my dream to have a Jellyfish reunion at IPO. So we'll see.
Kind of in closing, David, this isn't really a question, more of an observation. And I think you've defined power pop as simply just melodic rock and roll in a way. It's never seemed to have its own genre in that you can't go into a record store and head to the power pop section. But it seems that every musical genre has certain bands that fall into that category. Even like the hard rock, which I love, it has someone like Enough's Enough, who I would consider power pop.
Yes, of course.
It's kind of like this anomaly of music which can be part of any style.
Oh, yeah. Well, man, I mean, yeah, you have another 4 hours. We could talk about this forever. It's something that's in the immediate hearts and minds of so many fans of this genre. Power pop. Well, you go on Facebook, there are a lot of groups that are devoted to power pop. But probably the most common discussion is this band power pop or are they not? And there's a lot of heated argument over it. The term has never been codified correctly. I mean, there is no definition that you can write out that every power pop fan is going to be satisfied with. It's just not going to happen. Yes, melodic rock and roll is a very good definition. But then, you look at bands like, I'll just take one out of the blue, Kansas, for example. Are they melodic rock and roll? Yeah. Are they power pop? Absolutely not. And then you have other bands that, where there's Jellyfish. Are they melodic rock and roll? Absolutely. Are they power pop? Well, maybe a couple of songs are. But then some have this strong Queen influence and they get into, a little bit more of the keyboard proggy thing. That's certainly not power pop. There are certain bands where it goes without saying because they check all the boxes. And sometimes those boxes aren't tangible. They're more visceral. You just know, you hear it. They've got the harmonies, they've got the hooks, they've got the background vocals, they've got the lyrics about unrequited love, which power pop, of course, has always been a lot about. But is there ever going to be agreement en masse about power pop? God, no.
It'd be the most confusing, the most largest section in the record store ever.
There are some record stores that have had power pop sections, at least in the States. Yeah, I don't know that I actually ever saw any in the UK or Stockholm, which are the two places in Europe where I've gone record shopping. But yeah, even here, not too many. But yeah, there's never going to be mass agreement about every band in the genre. And you touched upon something. One thing about power pop is it's just never really forged much of an identity. The skinny ties were around in the late 70s, early 80s. And if that had flourished a little bit more, then that would have helped a lot. But, that fell out of favor as quickly as it fell in. I mean, let's take indie rock, which is a much bigger, wider genre than power pop, but they had an identity. You had the thrift store clothes, you had those thick rimmed glasses on the guys, you had the beards, the 19th century beards. The clothing was the biggest thing, of course. You had to dress like you only had $10 to buy clothes. And also another core ingredient of indie rock was being very introverted. I mean, these were people who, if they said hello to you, they looked down. They couldn't look you in the eye. But they all united over that. And the best indie rock bands were the ones that just had enough courage to go on stage. And the reason that all these people loved them is because I could never do that. And they're like me, but they're doing it. These are my heroes. Power pop just never had that kind of identity. And I don't think it ever will. Power pop fans, they dress differently. They look different. And that actually is one of the reasons it's, in my opinion, at least, that it's never been able to flourish as a genre. Everything else, even Northern Soul, you think about that, which formed in Northern England in the UK. It was all these DJs finding rare soul records from the States. Even that, which wasn't even bands playing, but just DJs, even that had this identity. You had the shorts. There was a whole culture around it. There's never been a culture around power pop. It's a shame. But maybe part of it is we just can't agree on what it is. We really can't. I don't know if we ever will.
David, thank you ever so much. I've loved chatting with you and hearing all your stories. It's been great to catch up.
Yeah, likewise, Rob. Likewise. It was a pleasure being on. Thank you again for having me.
All right, David, you take care.
You too, Rob. Thanks.
Big shout out to David Bash for taking the time to chat and sharing some wonderful stories. And also, if you like the music in this episode, that is my friends at Ashbury Keys, who I met at the International Pop Overthrow, so I felt it would be just right to have them on the show. If you like them, then please check out ashburykeys.com and tell them where you heard about them. Can't wait to see them all again too. Now, I know it's predictable, but thanks for continuing to support this show. If you can, please leave a review over on Apple Podcasts or simply tell some friends who might like to hear these conversations. The last few episodes have brought some really positive feedback. Maybe I'm getting the hang of this thing after 100 episodes. All previous shows can be found over at stvpod.com, and as mentioned earlier, if you want to get a little more involved, then I'd love to have you part of the Straight to Video Patreon page, which you can find at patreon.com/stvpod. So that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and look out for the International Pop Overthrow Festival when it arrives near your town. But in the meantime, please look after yourselves and speak real soon.